Welcome to the Bracket Factory and welcome to the latest thrilling episode, which comes to you from a fire engine museum in a small town in France. Now you're probably wondering what we're doing here, and we're here because we're on a short break climbing in the forest of Fontainebleau. Now of course this means nothing's happening in the Bracket Factory, so what I thought I'd do is pull together a short video showing the story that I've taken with the engine. So basically it's 6 months in 20 minutes. Now I know a lot of faithful followers will know this already, but some of the new subscribers to the channel need to play catch up, so this is your chance to catch up. Enjoy! So it all started when Bryan from Oak Swamp sent me a link for an engine on Facebook Marketplace. And being a sucker for big engines and projects, I decided to go and have a look. Now I confess I didn't know anything about American LaFrance engines, but the guy selling it, who was a nice bloke, could tell me a few things. Firstly, it was out of a 1949 Alf fire truck. It was big, exact capacity unknown, but in excess of 8 litres, I was told. I mean, I could see it was in a pretty rough state. You could see it'd been left outside, lots of things were rusty or rather neglected. But it is quite an imposing thing, and it did actually turn over. So on the strength of all that, I decided to buy it. Now at the time the Bracket Factory was full to the brim, as per usual, but Bryan kindly offered for me to store the engine down at the swamp while I got my house in order. So this is it. This is the American LaFrance V12 engine, just over 8 litres. It's out of a fire truck. So for resilience purposes, it has 2 of everything. It's got 2 ignition systems. So it's got a distributor here and a distributor there. It runs dual plugs per cylinder, so it has 24 spark plugs. It runs 4 coils. I think I might have said just over 8 litres, and it is an absolute monster, V12. So it's going to sit here while I make a cradle for it, and then we'll take it back, and the aim is to firstly get it started, and secondly stick it in the car. So watch this space. So back at the Bracket Factory, it was time to build a cradle for this thing, and as it was very similar to the sort of trolleys that were used to carry bombs in the Second World War, it became known as the bomb trolley. So of course, as soon as the bomb trolley was finished, we had to do some testing. So with the help of the Bracket Factory test pilot, we put it through its paces. Testing done, it was time to go back down to Oak Swamp and load the engine up. Now that was easy said than done, because this engine is very heavy, about 650 kilograms I think. So what I had to do was build a special gantry for it using a bit of RSJ and some scaffolding poles. And somehow, without killing ourselves, we managed to lift the engine up and offer it up to the bomb trolley. After a bit of in situ fettling, the engine was lowered down into the bomb trolley and we could stand back, take stock and chill out. Now sitting here, having a barbecue,
having a Guinness,
having a beer, chilling out, hatching plans for the future.
Yeah.
And of course that plan involved taking the engine back to the Bracket Factory. So with the help of Steve, we loaded the engine and bomb trolley back on the lorry, took it back to the Bracket Factory, unloaded it so I could take stock and see what I bought. The first thing I did was give it a damn good clean, because it had about 25 years worth of general gunge, grime, dust and dirt piled on top of it. Then I could start to assess the damage. I could see that the distributors were in a right old state, parts broken and missing everywhere. And at some stage the engine had fallen over and smashed the oil canister into the side of the engine, which had caused it to be quite severely bent. So of course a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, so I decided to start off with the ignition system. Now fortunately I was able to get new points for these distributors, but everything else is completely unobtainable. The caps and rotor arms are impossible to find, but I had one good cap out of 2 and I only had one rotor arm, but that itself was broken. So after doing a full rebuild of the distributor, putting new points in, I had to tackle the rotor arm, and that involved turning up a tiny carbon bush and putting it in the arm. So when that bush was made, it was time to put it all together and do a complete test. So in episode 5 of this series, I put the entire ignition system together, explain how the V12 works because it has 2 coils, connect a rubber drive to the distributor and run a test. Fortunately, that test worked, so it was time to swing the guns round to the lubrication system. I knew at the very least I had to sort out that bent oil filter canister, and I also had some very severe concerns about the sump. So off came that oil filter, and it was time to assess the damage. Now the filter housing is actually quite a thick gauge steel, and this was completely bent, and I actually tried to bend it and straighten it flat, but that was to no avail, so the only option was to cut the bottom off and weld a plate on the bottom. And as if by magic, it is done. So I parted off this, made the hole, drilled that one there. That's important. That needs to that corresponds with this little. So oil filter canister reassembled and put back on the engine. It was time to turn the attention to the sump. Now when I went to drain the oil, there wasn't any, and I was soon to find out why. After dropping the sump, cleaning out mountains of old gunge and oil, and giving the whole thing a damn good clean, I got to realise what had actually happened. At some stage, the big old girl had been dropped on its sump, cracked the sump, and no doubt that's what caused all the oil to leak out. So I cleaned up the crack as carefully as I could, and I had a crack at TIG welding it. I've got to confess, it was an absolute pig to weld. Oil impregnated aluminium is an absolute sod. But all's well that ends well, and in the end I got a decent repair. So after putting the baffles back in the bathtub sized sump, sticking the sump back on the engine, filling the old girl with oil, it was time for a quick test. So I cranked over the engine with the sump full of oil, and it gradually started to push oil up into the canister, which showed I had some kind of working pump and oil pressure. And then everything was absolutely fantastic, and I was getting ready to actually try and start the engine when I noticed something looked a little bit odd. So if you watched the last episode, you remember at the very end I spotted that this valve here, you can see that gap there, must be sticking. So I thought it was a simple case of just knocking that valve back. So let's just quickly take a look at, so this exhaust valve, this is the one of the ones that was sticking. Now if I put my pen inside there against the head of the exhaust valve, watch what happens when I turn the engine over. Of course the pen goes Now look what happens when I stick it down inside this one. Nothing at all, and you've not got to be a rocket scientist to know that that's not good at all. So there was only one thing for it, and that was to take the cylinder head off and have a look inside. So that's what an exhaust valve should look like, and that's what we've got. Oh, there it is. And that's our exhaust valve. Notice how A, it's very rounded, and B, it's a lot smaller than it should be. That basically tells me that it's been slamming around in there for a very long time, and will have also obviously knackered the valve seat. So we've got a bit of a challenge there, haven't we? So as you've probably guessed, valves for these engines are completely unobtainable. So what I had to do was find a valve that would fit or could be modified to fit. So what I ended up finding is a valve from a DAF truck. Now this valve had the same stem diameter, very important, had the same head diameter as an inlet valve, but was slightly too long. But too long was something we could cope with. I also needed to recut the valve seat, so I got a valve seat cutter, and I also needed some plasticine. So the reason I've got plasticine is so that I can cut the valve seat in situ. If I stuff the ports with plasticine, then I can make sure that none of the swarf actually goes down into the cylinder. And that actually worked, and I managed to cut a nice valve seat so that I could offer up my new valve. Once I knew it was all seating nicely, I just had to machine the collet groove in the new valve and start to assemble the whole thing. In the end, it all went together quite nicely, but I had one major niggle, and that was the condition of the bores. As I'd taken off all the subheads, I was able to poke a camera down inside the bores and have a look at them, and unfortunately they were really quite rusty, and I was faced with a dilemma: run it as is or take off the heads. Of course, I knew the correct answer, and that was off with her heads. Now this was a massive amount of work. I don't think the cylinder heads had been off for decades and decades. Everything needed thoroughly cleaning before I even started to undo the bolts, and of course I was delving into uncharted territory. As well as the 6 subheads, it has 2 main cylinder heads, and they weigh an absolute ton. Well, not a ton, but probably 40 kilograms each. With the heads off, I was able to have a good look inside. The condition of the bores wasn't too bad, a fair amount of rust, some worse than others, but certainly recoverable. It was at this point I had to stock up on elbow grease, as there was a hell of a lot of cleaning, fettling, scraping, and generally trying to make the bores suitable to get this engine running. Many hours of scraping, cleaning, fettling, scraping, more cleaning and more fettling, and the engine was actually starting to look reasonable. I think it's at this time I decided to bring out the elbow grease t-shirt, as it seemed quite appropriate. But of course that was just the cylinders. I also then had to turn my attention to the cylinder heads and remove all the valves, all 24 of them. In the end, after a thorough inspection, I decided to change 4 of the valves rather than just the one. So then, after thoroughly cleaning the heads, it was time for reassembly, and I decided to use the original gaskets, as A, they cleaned up quite nicely, and B, the price of the gaskets was almost as much as the engine itself. So then I could put all the subheads back on, and we were finally back in the game. So next, the focus will be the final preparations to start the engine, i.e. the final countdown. So lots of new gaskets were handmade, lots of things were cleaned up, lots of bolts were cleaned up, and the manifolds, inlet and exhaust were put back on. So when that lot was back on, it was time to set up the ignition. Now I knew that the distributors actually work, so I'd tested them, but I still had to set up the timing. Ignition wise, it's effectively 2 6-cylinder engines, hence it's got 2 coils, 2 sets of points, 2 top dead centres and 2 of everything. It was a bit of a puzzle, but we got there in the end. If you want to see how that was done, go along and check out episode 12. Then it was time for a new set of HT leads. Now the original engine has approximately 24 metres of HT lead, but of course I'm only using one distributor. The other one is redundant, so I only needed a mere 12 metres of HT lead. HT leads made, and it was time for the carbs. Now there's an entirely separate episode about these carbs specifically. A lot of work went into restoring them, and in that video I also explain exactly how they work. A linkage was also made for the carbs, and by this time we're actually getting very close. So a quick check around everything, and it was time to wheel the old girl out and see if she would run. So the answer was yes, thankfully. So I'd obviously got the ignition sorted out correctly, but I didn't really want to run it for very long without any kind of cooling system. So attention was now on the water pump. Now the water pump is a very impressive thing and designed so that it was fully rebuildable, but it was an absolute battle to do that. This screw needed to be removed and it was a total fight. And in the end, I used a blob of weld and that actually broke the seal and allowed me to unscrew it. A new screw was made and the whole thing was rebuilt using new bearings and a new seal which can be packed manually. It was a monster amount of work, but it all came good in the end. So there it is, all fitted together. Looking a lot like a Spitfire really. Anyway, so the pump is all on and sorted. Quite pleased with how it's turned out. Of course, it might leak. I'm pretty sure it's going to pump water. It might leak, but if it does leak, I'm pretty sure I can sort the leak out. Of course, we do need a radiator, and I do have one enormous radiator there. Got to be 2 foot wide, and a slightly smaller radiator there, which is off a Chevy, 50 Chevy truck. I'm not sure what that's off. It was kind of given to me by a chap. Don't know what it's off though, but it's big. Anyway, more about that later. So the first thing I did was to take off that fan. Now, whilst it looked very cool and a bit like a Spitfire, it was both too big and too lethal. And then I made a simple frame for that Chevy radiator. Once the radiator was fitted, I made a little subframe and fitted an electric fan. I decided to go for an electric fan so that I can easily turn it on and turn it off depending on the temperature. And also so I didn't cut my fingers off. Rad and fan fitted, I decided to make some gratuitously complicated connecting pipes. Because the output pipe from the engine is 3 inches and the input I think is about 1.5 inches, I decided to make this cone. It is gratuitously complicated and involves lots of maths, and if you're interested in that, go and have a look at episode 12. So next up was a proper dash, and on here I've got my ignition switch, starter button, fan switch, water temperature, oil pressure and RPM. The rev counter was a cheap Chinese eBay job. Top tip, don't bother. So after a few little niggles, it's now been connected up and it is full of water, and there is nothing leaking out from anywhere at the moment. There was a little leak out of there, and there was a little leak out of there, and there was a little leak out of there, but that's all been sorted. So what I'm going to do now is leave it overnight, and the water will either stay in the cooling system, it will leak out onto the floor, or it will leak inside the engine. Either way, that will go down if anything changes. So if it doesn't, there's only one thing to do, isn't there? Start her up. So it was pretty much mission accomplished, and the engine ran really nicely. And after this, I turned my attention mainly to the gearbox, clutch, chassis, that sort of stuff. But there was one more thing I wanted to do, and that was to try and get a bit more noise out of it, because those massive exhaust manifolds were really killing it. So I decided to fabricate 12 individual stubs and take her for another spin. So sit back and enjoy the music. Right, I'm going to do a cheeky startup because I need to drain the front, I need to drain it all down. So let's start it up before I do that, just to make sure it works and just to remind us what kind of noise it's going to make. I'm going to need these, it's a clue. So I've got two 12-volt batteries connected in parallel, so it's still 12 volts. Fuel pump, so Fuel pump's on. This is my secret weapon, of course. This is full of petrol, so ignition on. Squirt that down. Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo. I think that'll do. Switch it all off. I need to run away. So there you have it, all caught up in 20 minutes. So if you like that, please do hit like. If you want to see how the journey unfolds moving forward, please do hit subscribe. Please let me know what you think in the comments. And if you're a faithful follower, please rest assured that I'm back in the bracket factory next week and we're going to crack on with that front engine mount. So for now, that's about it. So thanks for watching.